Few armies in history have a reputation as fearsome as those of the Mongol Empire. During the height of the empire, the Mongol horde carried a well-earned reputation for invincibility, inflicting devastation upon enemy armies and cities. So thorough was this carnage that many writers who experienced it firsthand could only describe it as a punishment sent by heaven. For how else could one explain how so many cities and armies fell so quickly? In this video, we will attempt to explain various aspects of the medieval Mongol military and provide insight as to what made the Horsemen of the Great Khan so successful, including an overview of their tactics, logistics, siegecraft, recruitment, and more. Did you know that we have a whole podcast dedicated to the history of the Mongols? We do. You can find the link to it in the description and the pinned comment. The Mongols are of course most well known for their horse archers, the byproduct of their lifestyle. In the great grass seas of the Eurasian steppe, the Mongols and other nomads spent their entire lives on horseback, learning to ride before they could walk in order to manage their great herds of sheep, goat, oxen, camels and horses. A lifetime in the saddle in the often harsh conditions of Inner Asia left the nomads excellent riders with incredible endurance, able to endure hardships beyond that of sedentary peoples. Each Mongol learned to shoot and construct their bows and arrows from a young age, beginning with a child's bow to hunt marmots and small mammals, gradually increasing the strength of the bow until able to master the powerful composite recurve warbow. Highly mobile, deadly at range, and strategically swift compared to infantry armies, the horse archer, when used properly, could be the master of the medieval battlefield. Many aspects of the above description of nomadic life and warfare as mounted archers are easily recognizable to a scholar of earlier nomadic steppe peoples like the Xiongnu and Scythians. This Chinese description of the Xiongnu in the 2nd century BC is just as applicable to the Mongols well over 1,000 years later. The little boys start out by learning to ride sheep and shoot birds and rats with a bow and arrow, and when they get a little older they shoot foxes and hares which are used for food. Thus all the young men are able to use a bow and act as armed cavalry in time of war. It is their custom to herd their flocks in times of peace and make their living by hunting, but in periods of crisis they take up arms and go off on plundering and marauding expeditions. This seems to be their inborn nature. For long-range weapons they use bows and arrows, and swords and spears at close range. If the battle is going well for them they will advance, but if not, they will retreat, for they do not consider it a disgrace to run away. Their only concern is self-advantage, and they know nothing of propriety or righteousness. For these earlier peoples, many of the same basic tenets of mounted warfare were utilized by both them and the Mongols, such as hit-and-run tactics, envelopment, and the infamous feigned retreat. Contemporaries to these earlier peoples remark on their endurance and hardiness, their skill as horsemen, and the danger of their arrows. There are, however, several aspects in which the Mongol warrior found himself better equipped than his forebears, in the form of several technological advancements to their tack and weapons. The Scythians, for instance, had only soft padded saddles for their mounts, essentially 2 leather pads held to the horse with a girth strap. It provided minimal shock absorption for the rider and little for him to maintain his place beyond his thighs. The Xiongnu and Huns were better supplied with the development of the treed saddle, a sturdy wooden frame cushioned for the rider. It was a more secure base for the archer to shoot from, which also made it more difficult to unhorse him. Leaning into the front of these saddles lifted them, allowing the hips to absorb more of the shocks from riding and reduce jostling from the horse's movement. What these early riders lacked, from the Xiongnu and Huns to the Parthians and the Romans, was the paired stirrup. When the stirrup emerged is a matter of controversy. The earliest stirrups were made of materials like wood which do not preserve well archaeologically. But it seems likely the stirrup, in a form easily recognizable today, was developed around the 3rd century AD in northern China or Mongolia, spreading west via Turkic tribes, arriving in Europe with the Avars by the 6th century. Stirrups provided several advantages. They provided a much more secure platform, allowing the rider to raise himself in the saddle for extra leverage and reach in close combat, or for the horse archer to stand and use his leg and core muscles to help draw heavier bows. Further, the knees could better absorb the jolts from the horse's movement and guide the horse in the heat of battle. Outside of combat, the benefits were more significant, particularly for the nomad. Needing to be on horseback all day while tending their herds, the stirrup helps take pressure off of the horse's back. A skilled rider on a strong horse could now travel further and longer. When coupled with multiple remounts, the distance horsemen could march rose dramatically. The famed weapon of the horse archer was their composite bows. Rather than a self-bow, such as the Welsh longbow, which is made from a single piece of wood, the composite bow was made from layers of wood, horn and sinew. The horn and sinew increased the strength of the bow, transferring more energy to the arrow. Most composite bows of the steppe world were also recurved, the ears of the bows storing yet more energy, while providing leverage to aid the archer. Whereas a self-bow's strength can only be increased by making the bow larger or the archer stronger, the recurve composite bow remains relatively short without sacrificing power. The shorter bow made it more maneuverable on horseback, allowing Mongol warriors to even travel with heavier and lighter bows on them as the situation required. The composite bow was, however, in danger of warping from prolonged exposure to humidity. Not an issue in the generally dry steppes of Central Asia, but in wetter climates dangerous to the bow's health. To offset this, bows of the Xiongnu and Huns had the ends of their limbs strengthened with bone plates to reduce warping, but this made the bow heavier and decreased arrow velocity. In contrast, Mongol bows of the conquest era lacked bone plates, transferring more energy to the arrows and granting them greater penetrative power and range, but making them more susceptible to climate changes, perhaps accounting in part for reduced Mongol military effectiveness in Southeast Asia and Europe. Despite some modern claims, the Mongol conquests were not a result of a technological innovation in horse archery, as the technology itself had changed little once these above-mentioned developments were completed by the 4th to 5th centuries AD. For that, we must look to the military leadership of the Mongols and their innovations upon existing steppe traditions. Beyond these technological changes, the Mongol army of the 13th century shared many traits with steppe armies of the preceding centuries. The method of organizing armies using the decimal system was present among the Xiongnu. The highest commanders led divisions nominally of 10,000, while the smallest were squads of just 10 men who operated together. Traditionally, this system was based within the tribe, but it was the innovation of Chinggis Khan to largely break down the tribes of Mongolia and almost entirely replace them with the decimal system, removing minor chiefs and khans from power to ensure no alternatives to his rule. Earlier steppe confederations like the Xiongnu generally had an important imperial bodyguard and retinue, which often provided a number of the major leaders and generals of the empire. For the Mongols, this was originally the Nukurd of Temujin, the basis for the famed Keshig, which he expanded upon when he took the title of Chinggis Khan in 1206. The Keshig under the Mongols evolved beyond just bodyguards, but into a general staff, where top officers learned the ropes of command. From there they were appointed not only to lead armies, but to conquer and govern regions as the Mongol Empire expanded, and acted as important administrators. Sons of the royal families of subject kingdoms were taken into the Keshig as hostages to help secure the loyalty of their dynasty, but also to be essentially indoctrinated in Mongol imperial destiny, going through trials alongside the Mongols and amply rewarded. When they returned to their homelands, they were loyal servants of the Khan who helped to uphold his rule. The following example should prove illustrative of how Chinggis Khan innovated upon and evolved, rather than invented, traditional nomadic lifestyle and tactics. All nomadic horsemen learned to hunt from a young age, a means to protect their herds from predators and provide extra sustenance for their families. It also provided an excellent means to practice for war. For the Khitans of the Liao dynasty and the Mongols, large-scale hunting expeditions served as training for unit operations. In an operation called Nerge by the Mongols, an army of horsemen would form a rough circle, at times several days' journey in diameter, gradually tightening and driving all game before them into an arena where the nobility would take their pick of the hunt before leaving the rest to the men. While simple on paper, organizing this properly took considerable skill. Given the size of the operation, a timetable was set for each group operating in their military units to reach their destination and begin to push the game forward. To prevent animals from escaping, the various units had to be in contact and be coordinating to prevent holes in the line which would allow herds to slip through their grasp. Allowing animals to escape resulted in punishments. Following orders, meeting timetables, unit tactics, and discipline were the basic building blocks of Mongol successes, and what allowed their armies to outmaneuver their foes. While large-scale hunting expeditions were practiced across the Eurasian steppe, and its rules applied to warfare and battles, under the Mongols the Nerge itself became a military strategy. Time and time again, a Nerge was set over an entire region, designating a major city to be the meeting point. Mongol units would spread across the region, attacking small towns and villages, driving the rural populations towards the major city as the Nerge tightened. Refugees fled into the city, not just overwhelming its resources and thus reducing the length of the siege it could withstand, but also sowing chaos and confusion, for the terrified population brought stories of Mongol atrocities and spread fear, increasing the chance the city would submit rather than face Mongol wrath. At the founding of the Mongol Empire in 1206, perhaps the entirety of the Mongol army was lightly armored horse archers, made up of the Mongolian and Turkic tribes who had submitted or been conquered up to that point. The Keshik may have had heavier armor, but were still armed with their powerful bows, closing with the enemy only once they had been weakened by arrows. Chinggis Khan understood well the effectiveness of this force in the open field, but upon his first campaign against a sedentary society, that being the Tangut Kingdom of Xixia in 1209, he found that unless he could draw the enemy from their walls through a feigned retreat or starve them out, that fortifications could prove impassable. With his invasion of the Jurchen Jin dynasty in 1211, a solution presented itself in the mass defections of Jin forces to his army. Not just Khitans, a Mongolic people who loathed the Jin and were themselves skilled horse archers, but also numerous Han Chinese, who provided the Mongols with infantry, crossbowmen, and numbers. More significant was the defection of Chinese catapult specialists and engineers, one of whom, Shu Talahai, defected to the Mongols early in the invasion and was rewarded handsomely for sharing his knowledge, teams, and experience. Further capture of Chinese engineers, stonemasons, and carpenters brought further knowledge of how to attack cities and build siege equipment. This adoption of warriors and knowledge of defectors, vassals, and captives proved perhaps the greatest deviation from earlier nomadic empires. In order to conquer not just the fringes of sedentary states, as per earlier nomadic empires, but the sedentary state itself, the Mongols required the manpower and knowledge of those sedentary societies. Each culture the Mongols encountered and conquered provided them new resources and tools for their arsenal. With the Mongols themselves remaining primarily light horse archers, they used northern Chinese and Iranian infantry and siege engineers, southern Chinese and Korean naval knowledge, Khitan, Jurchen and Turkic horse archers, Armenian and Georgian heavy cavalry, and more. Within a few years of the start of the Mongol conquests, the Mongol leadership and Mongol-Turkic army corps of horse archers was supported by a large heterogeneous army. Able to pick the most effective tactics, weapons, armors, and warriors from the cultures of Eurasia, the Mongolian army was thus able to adapt to a variety of situations, well beyond what earlier nomadic empires could accomplish. It was the job of subject peoples to fill the military roles the Mongols themselves either could not fill or had no interest in filling themselves. The poor Khwarezmian defense in 1220 can be explained in part as the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad anticipating pillaging horse archers and not a large, disciplined army ably utilizing siege weapons and technology. The Mongols also showed themselves willing to use gunpowder weapons in their wars in China. The Mongol Empire fractured in the second half of the 13th century. Debate rages as to how the Mongolian military in each independent Khanate continued to develop, and to what extent they were influenced by local military tradition. Generally, the debate steers towards questioning if the Mongols converted to heavier forms of cavalry. The presence of true Mongolian heavy cavalry in the early years of the empire is not universally accepted, with it often said that the small Mongolian horse lacked the strength to carry heavy armor. In the Ilkhanate, scholars like A.P. Martinez have suggested the Mongols adopted medium or heavy cavalry to better contend with Mamluk forces, and artwork from the Ilkhanate shows a preponderance of heavily armored Mongolian forces. An aspect of this argument is that the Mongols even began to sedentarize in the Ilkhanate, abandoning nomadism altogether, while their horses mixed with larger Persian breeds in order to carry the greater weight of armor, but making them less suited to the open steppe. Other scholars, such as Reuven Amitai, have found the argument unconvincing, suggesting that it remained the job of oft-mentioned Armenian and Georgian vassals to act as heavy cavalry, while the Mongols themselves continued as light horse archers. Similar arguments have been put forth for the Mongols within the Yuan dynasty, where it has been suggested that Mongol troops adorned heavier armor taken from stores of the fallen Song dynasty. In the territories of the Golden Horde and Chagatai Khanate, where Turkic influence and access to the steppes was greatest, there can be no doubt in the continued predominance of light horse archers. By the latter half of the 14th century, it was lightly armoured Chagatai horse archers which Timur led to begin his conquests. Much like Chinggis Khan, Timur incorporated outsiders into his army to utilize their skills and knowledge, overcoming the deficiencies that came from an army entirely of horse archers. Despite a growth in the percentage of heavy cavalry in Central Asia, in the steppe, heavy armor remained difficult and expensive to manufacture and maintain, especially for the average nomad. The vast majority of post-Mongol successor states, from the northern Yuan, the Timurids, the Kazakhs to the Crimean Khanate, saw their warriors continue to fight in a fashion recognizable not just to the Mongols of the 13th century, but to the Gokturks of the 7th century, the Huns of the 4th century, to the Xiongnu and even the Scythians. The Mongol conquests were not a result of a sudden transformation in the technology and lifestyle of nomadism, but of skilled leadership, innovating upon existing customs and taking advantage of the tools of both nomadic and sedentary cultures. While the Mongol army of the 13th century is often presented as a vast disorganized horde overwhelming its foes through sheer numbers, this could not be further from reality. The army of the Great Khans was a well-disciplined and strictly organized host, with a level of complexity which was part of the key to Mongol military successes around Eurasia. Most Turkic and Mongolic nomadic armies of the Great Eurasian Steppe were organized through the decimal system, dating back to the time of the Xiongnu. In this system, warriors were grouped in multiples of 10, 100, 1000, up to 10,000. These divisions were kept within tribal lines. Men from one tribe would not make up a decimal unit with men from another tribe. It was the innovation of Chinggis Khan during his unification of the Mongols to largely break down these tribal ties. With few exceptions of tribes like the Ongut who showed their loyalty, Chinggis Khan dissolved the old tribal organization and reformed the Mongol tribes into these decimal units for social organization. As new nomadic tribes were added to his empire, Chinggis was able to likewise integrate their warriors among these units. All new recruits of this system were held to the same rigid standards of discipline set out by Chinggis Khan, mandating strict adherence to the orders of the commander. Non-Mongol nomads even had to shave their heads in a distinctive Mongol hairstyle. instead of a confederation of tribes agreeing to follow a single leader. By the time Chinggis Khan began attacking sedentary powers in 1209, he was followed by a host which had assumed the Mongol identity, a unified single entity. By largely removing the original tribal allegiances and the old tribal chiefs from power, Chinggis ensured all ties of loyalty led directly to him, and that tribal feuding would not be able to tear apart his empire. Further, Chinggis Khan extended this decimal system to their families as well. Each unit, from 10 men to 1,000, had its corresponding civilian unit made up of their families, supplying much of the equipment and serving as the new basis for taxation. The base unit of the Mongol decimal system was the Arban, or 10 lightly armoured horse archers, supplying their own bows and horses. The smallest organisational unit, it was quite comparable to the similarly sized Contubernium of the Roman legions. These were men who had to live, train, hunt and fight together, a unit designed to be self-sufficient and move on its own as necessary. Carried with these 10 men were their spare horses, tools for repairing equipment and clothes, cooking utensils and other supplies. Often they travelled with a felt tent, ger or in Turkish yurt, for shelter, as well as goats, sheep or even cattle or camels for hauling a cart with their extra equipment. Down to its lowest levels, the Mongol army was intended to be as self-sufficient and mobile as possible, so when travelling long distances or designating a meeting point, each unit could move on its own. Building on this foundation, Mongol army units could move independently to surround larger, less maneuverable enemy armies. Discipline for the Arban was strict. Should one man within the Arban flee a battle, then the other 9 men would be put to death. With the intention that strong bonds of loyalty would build between them, such a threat was a burden few were willing to bear. More important than draconian punishment was reward. Men could be expected to be rewarded for meritorious service. One of Chinggis Khan's promulgations was to forbid looting until after the battle was won. Only then would all the loot be collected, tallied and distributed among the soldiers. This ensured the army would not break down into men scrambling for loot and allow the enemy to escape, and that every soldier could now earn a share for his service. Further, the widows and children of fallen soldiers were cared for as well. From his own difficult childhood, Chinggis Khan knew what social upheaval was caused by the abandonment of families. By keeping soldiers content with the knowledge their families would be protected, Chinggis Khan prevented the societal infighting that could tear his union apart and reduce the effectiveness of his armies. It was the efforts at this level which instilled the fierce Mongol discipline and loyalty to their commanders noted by all of the medieval authors who encountered them. 10 Arbans formed a Jagan, 100 men. 10 of these formed a Mingan, or 1,000 men, and 10 Mingans formed the most famous unit, the Tumen, 10,000 men. While the Tumen is more well known, the Mingan was the more important and common in terms of administration and command. When Chinggis Khan declared the Mongol Empire in 1206, the Secret History of the Mongols, the chronicle written for the imperial family after his death, informs us of 95 Mingans and who was assigned to command each of them. The numbers of each Mingan were only nominally 1,000. Some would be greater and some lesser due to the realities of battlefield losses or incorporation of new tribes. Nonetheless, it allows us to estimate the Mongol army in 1206 had about 95,000 men, soon enlarged with the submission of neighbouring tribes over the following years. Based off this number, assuming a ratio of warriors to the general population of 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, the population of the region has been estimated at around 600 to 800,000 people, with higher estimates of 1 million. Similar figures for the region at the beginning of the 20th century. Nomadic societies did not distinguish between warriors and civilians. All men between the ages of 15 to 60 could be called up for war, and since all nomads learned to ride a horse and shoot a bow, each had the skills for war. Compared to sedentary societies in China, Europe and the Islamic world, a far greater portion of the male population could be considered warriors and called up for battle. This is how the comparatively small population of Mongolia could raise armies large enough to combat the great strength of the Jurchen Jin dynasty. Each division was given considerable freedom in how they achieved their goals. Aside from setting the target and the timeline to accomplish the task, interference from higher command was minimal. Numerous Mongol commanders consistently operated independently from the Great Khan, separated at times by thousands of kilometers. In the early 1220s, picked generals like Jebe and Subutai in the western steppe and Mukhali in northern China campaigned independently of Chinggis Khan, at that time conquering the Khwarezmian Empire. Unlike Timur, who never let a campaign be led by anyone but himself, the military system of the Great Khans allowed them to place complete trust in their commanders, who routinely led armies across the continent and returned without hint of seeking independence. The Mongol High Command was a flexible and very experienced body. The men chosen to lead the imperial armies at the beginning of the conquests had fought alongside Chinggis Khan for years, joining him when he was a minor warlord and sticking beside him throughout his early trials. These were the Nukurd, followers who had risen through the ranks, proving not just their loyalty but their ability. Their background on the steppe hierarchy was diverse, some his distant relations, some members of the original steppe aristocracy, while others were simple herders who had shown military ability or aided the Khan. Their elevation and position relied on the Khan's continued favour, making them utterly loyal to him. With the declaration of the Mongol Empire in 1206, perhaps the most important institution of the Mongolian military was the Keshik, the imperial bodyguard. Established in 1204 and carrying over many members of the Nukurd, the Keshik was expanded to 10,000 men in 1206. Made up of younger sons and brothers of the commanders of 10, 1,000 and 10,000, sons of subject rulers and worthy commoners, the Keshik served as the Khan's bodyguard, elite units, royal household, and much of the imperial administration. The Keshik was divided into three main groups: 8,000 Terekut, who protected the Khan during the day, 1,000 quiver bearers, Korchi, the only men who could wear arrow quivers in the presence of the Khan, and an elite unit of 1,000 called Kepta-Ud, who guarded the Khan at night, and only fought on the battlefield if the Khan himself was present. Within the day guard was a further 1,000-man unit of braves, or Bahadurs in Mongolian, who formed the heavily armoured vanguard of the Keshik. Discipline was strict. No one approached the Khan's person without first being searched and vetted by the Keshik. All Keshik commanders outranked commanders of equivalent-sized units in the regular army. The Keshik also served as a military college. The young men brought into the Keshik learned the ropes of command and the necessities of strategy, tactics, logistics, and training, so they could be appointed to lead Mingans and armies. Many a well-known Mongol general had earned his position through meritorious service in the Keshik, such as Chomakun, Baiju, Kitbuka, and Subutai. Karacha Noyan, the successor of Timur, served in the Keshik of Chinggis Khan, and later his son Chagatai. Aside from the purely military role, the Keshik also acted as the closest servants of the Khan. Numerous officers of the Keshik are named, the Khan's elite bodyguards also maintaining his personal herds, equipment, weapons, clothing, camp and musical instruments, organizing hunts, and preparing his meals. One office was specifically for the collection of items and animals left behind when the imperial camp moved, while another was for holding a parasol over the Khan. The Keshik also served as the most important administrators of the empire, with the chief judges, military leaders and governors and confidants of the Khan being members of the Keshik. Members of Mongke Khan's Keshik, like Mengisar and Bulgai, were the most powerful figures of the empire below the Great Khan himself, the senior ministers, judges of state, as well as head of the imperial guard. Due to its close proximity to the Khan and the lead princes of the empire, it was therefore a highly prestigious and valuable position to gain. As the Keshik was made up of sons of commanders and vassal lords, they were invariably hostages to ensure the loyalty of their families. those of foreign royalty, when they returned to their homeland, were expected to serve as loyal servants of the Khan upholding his rule. Richly rewarded and their positions hereditary, the Keshik was a reliable and powerful arm of the Great Khan's military and government. At the highest level, the Mongol army was organized into wings, associated with directions within Mongolia. The army of the left wing of Eastern Mongolia, Junka, the army of the right wing in Western Mongolia, Bara-Unkar, and the army of the center, the Imperial Ordu, which the Keshik and the Khan's personal troops were associated with. The heads of each of these divisions were the closest, most trusted followers of Chinggis Khan. Together, these formed the Mongolian Regular Army. Under this system, there was a dual level of elites: the Altan Uruk, the family and descendants of Chinggis Khan, and the Karachu, the Noyans, commanders appointed often from humble beginnings to lead armies. Working alongside the regular army was the Tama. First mentioned during the reign of Ogadai, the Tama was something of an occupation force, made up of a large percentage of non-Mongol troops and officers, and generally drawn from the various Mingans. It was often commanded by a member of the Keshik called a Tamachi. The Tama was placed on the frontiers of the Mongol Empire, a largely cavalry force which would situate itself in the best available pasture. They were a consolidating force which would move with the frontier as the empire expanded. Unlike the great invasions which saw the Mongols rapidly pass through a region and depart, the Tama was intended to spend years in the region and, if necessary, set up permanently. Acting as temporary military governors, behind the advance of the Tama, the permanent civilian administration would be established, and the region thus fully incorporated into the Mongol Empire. Crushing what remained of local resistance, the Tama raided, extorted, and subjugated the independent powers on the empire's borders. One Tamachi, Chomakun, completed the subjugation of the former Khwarezmian territory, Iran, and into the Caucasus during his deployment. Since the Mongols did not rebuild the fortifications they destroyed, the Tama also acted as the empire's border guard, desolating and patrolling the borders as necessary to protect the empire from attack. The Tama comprised two main forces: the main body, situated in several camps in the pasture, and an advance force of scouts posted closer to cities and between the camps, called Alginchi. As the empire expanded, greater numbers of sedentary peoples were incorporated into the military. These roles could be shockingly inhumane, such as the Hashar. The Hashar, so called in the Persian sources, was a forced levy of local peoples driven before the Mongols as living shields against enemy arrows to push siege equipment and to fill in enemy moats with dirt or their own bodies. This was particularly common in Chinggis Khan's campaigns in North China and against the Khwarezmian Empire. Yet the Mongols also learned relatively quickly that sedentary peoples could provide knowledge, military roles, and manpower the Mongols themselves lacked. It was most notably in the form of Chinese siege engineers, but within a few years of the invasion of the Jurchen Jin, more Han Chinese were fighting for the Mongols than there were Mongols fighting in North China. Likewise, as the Mongols expanded westwards, subject peoples served them in a variety of supplementary roles. The Mongols, primarily lightly armoured horse archers, were more than happy to allow their subjects to take on more vulnerable positions on the battlefield. These same groups also served the Mongols in other roles, especially as labour or manning local garrisons. These local forces, the Cherik, are what Mongolian regional governors had to rely upon to put down local uprisings, as Mongol horsemen were utilised for the expansion of the empire. Sedentary kingdoms not destroyed in the initial invasions had to provide their own armies and commanders to serve alongside and under the Mongols, such as the Tangut Kingdom and Armenian Cilicia. While continuing to fight in their traditional manner, and not directly incorporated into the Mongol army, they had to follow the commands of a Mongolian general. In the 12th century Mongolian steppe, warfare was between forces of highly mobile horse archers, though a few forts were scattered across the region, largely left over from the rule of the Khitan Liao dynasty. With raids on China uncommon in this period, There was little opportunity for up-and-coming warlords like the young Temujin to learn how to assault fortified sites. With the declaration of the Mongol Empire in 1206 and consolidation of his rule over the region, Temujin, now taking the title of Chinggis Khan, could begin new assaults on China. His first target was not the immense Jurchen-ruled Jin dynasty, but its vassal, the Tangut Xixia kingdom. Here, the newly formed Mongol Empire had its first test against cities and forts. Lacking siege equipment, the Mongols could rely on only 3 tactics. The first was the simplest, a blockade to attempt to starve the city into submission. The second was the feigned retreat. Appearing to panic before the walls, the Mongols would trick the garrison into running out to pursue them, or collect seemingly abandoned animals, goods and slaves, only for the Mongols to suddenly fall upon them. The final was the most complicated, used first against the Tangut capital, modern-day Yinchuan. A nearby river would be dammed or redirected, forcing the waters towards the city. Chinese walls, made of rammed earth, would be undermined, and when the water stagnated, it spread disease throughout the city. The first attempt against the Tangut was not a smashing success, for the Mongols accidentally flooded their own camp in the process. Still, by 1210, Chinggis Khan succeeded in taking the submission of the Tangut, and these 3 tactics were to be utilized again and again. The next lesson in the sieging of cities came in 1211, when Chinggis Khan led his armies against the Jin dynasty. The Jin's border defenses, the predecessor to the more famous Great Wall of the Ming dynasty, ran through modern Inner Mongolia's steppeland, consisting of a long ditch and earthen wall. This was bypassed as the tribes manning them submitted to Chinggis Khan and let him through. Over their first year of battle against the Jin, the Mongols routinely won in dramatic field battles like Yahuling and devastated the countryside, but cities, towns and forts could only be taken when the garrisons were drawn into feigned retreats. As Mongol victories over the Jin armies mounted, and the dynasty seemingly looked like it was losing the mandate of heaven, a steady flood of defections of Khitan, Jurchens and Chinese provided Chinggis Khan the secrets to the ancient Chinese arts of taking cities. Some of these were basic tools. Woodworkers constructed simple rams, ladders and mobile shelters which could be used to approach the walls. Vast numbers of defected or press-ganged Chinese infantry could climb ladders or push siege equipment. More valuable were actual siege specialists and engineers who provided the specialized tools of taking cities. Large wheeled scaling ladders, including the folding cloud ladder, provided quick means for large groups of men to mount the walls. A large wooden screen held onto a mobile arm provided cover for these scaling ladders from enemy arrows. Some of the most effective were the ranged weapons, catapults and oxbows. The Chinese used a traction catapult. Teams of men would pull on ropes attached to one end of the arm of the catapult, thus propelling its projectile through manpower. The oxbow was essentially a large crossbow used to pick the defenders off the walls. These tools and the experience to build them were adopted by the Mongols quickly. Cities would now fall to them with regularity, and by 1215, after a protracted and bloody siege, they took the Jin capital of Zhengdu, modern Beijing. When taking a city that had refused to submit to them, such as Zhengdu, another tool was employed: massacres. The intention was to spread a simple message. Cities which immediately surrendered were treated relatively leniently, generally needing only to send tribute, perhaps supply soldiers, or tear down their fortifications. Cities which tried to resist were severely punished, especially if through their resistance they brought on Mongol losses or killed a Mongol prince, in which case the destruction was thorough, the slaughter indiscriminate. Individuals of skill, such as artisans, engineers and craftsmen, were spared, sent elsewhere for service to the Great Khan. Some women and children were taken as slaves, and the remainder of the citizenry slaughtered. Slaughter allowed the Mongol troops to exert their pent-up frustration at a long siege, but generally the Mongols viewed it as a practical necessity. They lacked the numbers to provide garrisons for every city, and didn't want to engage in lengthy sieges for every settlement. The fear of the consequences that would come from resistance was just as effective a tool as the most powerful catapult. Horrific atrocities, such as building towers of severed heads to intentionally exaggerate the numbers killed in cities, all served to buttress an image of the Mongols as an unstoppable and implacable foe. Many cities would simply submit rather than face such an existential threat. The war against the Khwarezmian Empire provided the next greatest evolution of Mongol siege techniques. Muhammad II Khwarezm Shah's defensive strategy against the Mongols consisted of maintaining garrisons across his empire's northeastern frontier, based on the simple but sadly mistaken calculation that the Mongols lacked the means to take cities. Chinggis Khan brought with him teams of Chinese siege engineers to construct his weapons, and by then his army was well versed in the art of the siege. With access to large teams of engineers, Chinggis Khan would array vast groups of catapults to concentrate on a single section of the enemy wall, firing day and night in an incessant barrage, demoralizing the defenders and grounding the fortifications to dust, or bringing pots of naphtha into the city to spread fire and chaos. Mongol troops, protected by mobile shelters, would advance on the walls, using their excellent archery to pick off any defender foolish enough to stick his head over the crenellations. Feigned retreats repeatedly drew overconfident garrisons out to be slaughtered. The Khwarezm Shah's decisions to leave each city to its own defense allowed them all to be picked off one by one. Fear and demoralization were refined as tools of conquest, a psychological assault as well as physical. Massacres and absolute destruction rewarded cities which held out, like Urgench, or rose up after previously submitting, like Merv and Nishapur. Attacking the rural and lesser settlements around a major city and driving refugees into the city brought panic and exaggerated stories of Mongol prowess, and also stressed the city's resources. The flight of Khwarezm Shah Muhammad, hounded to his death by Jebe and Subutai, prevented the Khwarezmian leadership from becoming a rallying point to organize a defense. Fake letters were allowed to be intercepted by the Khwarezmians, claiming the Khwarezm Shah's mother was in cooperation with Chinggis Khan, which wrought further disunity. Another gruesome method was called the hashar in the Persian sources. This was the forced levy. Captive townfolk were forced at spear point before the Mongol army, making it appear larger than it was. During a siege, they were forced against the walls, taking the most vulnerable positions as veritable meat shields, soaking up enemy arrows while pushing siege equipment or filling in moats, often with their own bodies. The defenders were forced into the mental torment of having to fire on people from neighboring cities or allow them to advance the Mongol siege. The more valuable Mongol and Turkic horsemen were thus protected from menial labor and could keep their strength for the actual fighting. When Chinggis Khan returned to the Tangut Kingdom in 1226 for his final campaign, his army was well hardened at siege warfare. The Tangut cities now fell in quick succession, and when Chinggis died in August 1227, the Tangut capital was razed to join him. Mongol siege abilities continued to advance under Chinggis's son and successor, Ogadai. In North China, the Jurchen Jin were finally reduced. The Jin capital of Kaifeng was taken through a difficult year-long siege, in which it seems early gunpowder bombs were used by both sides. The Jin dropped them onto mobile shelters protecting sappers attempting to undermine the walls, while the Mongols used catapults to lob them into the city. Some historians, most notably Dr. Stephen Hoare, point to the possible use of early cannons during this fighting, but the evidence is controversial. The Mongols do not seem to have used gunpowder weapons outside of fighting in China and Japan. Mongol sieges in Korea met with surprising difficulty. At Kuju in late 1231, multiple assaults on the city were repulsed. one commander with a few picked men drove off repeated attacks by the Mongol vanguard. Attacks were launched on the walls day and night. Carts of dry grass and wood were pushed to the gates to burn them, only to be destroyed by Korean catapults. A shelter built before the walls to protect sappers was destroyed when the Koreans dug holes through their own walls to pour molten iron onto it. Scaling ladders were toppled by Korean polearms. Bundles of sticks soaked allegedly in human fat, set aflame and hurled into the city, could not be put out with water, but were smothered with mud and earth. One set of catapults was repulsed by Korean counter-artillery. Another, through constant barrage, breached the wall 50 times, and 50 times the defenders filled the gaps. After a month without headway, the siege was called off, the city deemed to be protected by heaven. A spirited resistance, as the Mongols faced throughout Korea, could hamper even their efforts. In the Rus principalities, the armies of Batu and Subutai were met with much greater success. The wooden walls of the low-lying Rus cities were easy prey for the warriors of the Great Khan. Palisades were erected around the cities to trap the townsfolk, protect the besiegers, and cover their actions. Catapult teams acting in unison made multiple breaches in the walls and spread fire in the cities. Few held out more than a few weeks. In the eastern half of the Hungarian kingdom, where fortified sites were made of wood in the easily accessible terrain of the Great Hungarian Plain, the Mongols were unstoppable. Depopulation in these areas reached as high as 70% by some estimates. To ensure the population of a given site was reduced, the Mongols would leave for a few days after taking the city. Those who had survived would come out from their hiding places in search of food or to begin to repair the damage. With their guard let down, Mongol riders would suddenly return and fall upon them, repeating this process until no more came out from hiding. In the more densely populated and rugged western half of Hungary past the Danube, where the major sites were protected by hard-to-access stone fortifications, the Mongols found their progress slowed. At Esztergom in early 1242, Hungary's main political centre, Hungarian prisoners were forced to build a screen of bundles of twigs before the city's moat to cover 30 siege engines. Once the catapults had brought down the city's towers and part of the walls, they began to hurl bags of dirt into the moat, the garrison unable to clear it due to the precision of Mongol archers. With it apparent the city was to be breached, the townsfolk set fire to the suburbs, destroyed or hid anything of value, then retreated to the citadel. A furious Batu, denied his prize, was unable to take the stone citadel. An able defense, led by Simon the Spaniard, commanding teams of ballistarius, referring either to crossbowmen or counter-siege engines, kept the Mongols from breaching the citadel. Batu pulled back from Esztergom, leaving nothing standing of the city but the citadel. Further difficulties were had at Székesfehérvár. The outer part of the city and its suburbs were razed by the Mongols, but again the stone citadel, defended by Hospitaller knights and their own counter-artillery, resisted the Mongol assaults. After a few days, the siege was lifted, and soon the Mongols began a slow withdrawal from Europe. For more on the reasons for a Mongol withdrawal from Europe, you can check out episode 19 of our podcast on the Mongols. But it seems that stone castles, built on hard-to-access sites, proved difficult for the Chinese-style catapults the Mongols used, with their crews reduced by enemy counter-artillery. The withdrawal in 1242 may have begun as a temporary retreat to prepare reinforcements and more catapults, only for political matters relating to the death of Ogedai Khan to keep them from immediately returning. When Hulagu set on his campaign against the Nizari assassins and the Caliph in the 1250s, he was met with a variety of well-defended sites. The Nizari strongholds were cunningly designed, nearly impregnable mountain fortresses. Most fell through negotiated surrender thanks to the capture of the Nizari Imam. Some resisted, and were so strong they only fell after lengthy blockades. Namasar near Alamut fell after a year, and Girdka on the eastern edge of the Elburz Mountains withstood a Mongol siege for 15 years. Unable to bring their large teams of catapults to bear upon them, such sites could hold out as long as their food stores did. For more accessible locales like Baghdad, built in the Great Mesopotamian floodplain, there was little chance for the isolated and outnumbered defenders. There, huge teams of catapults could work in unison unceasingly against designated sections of the walls. After only a few days of this, the walls of Baghdad were breached and the Mongols were in the city. At the start of 1260, Hulagu, assisted by troops from Georgia, Armenian Cilicia, the Principality of Antioch and County of Tripoli, took Aleppo, despite its well-maintained and sturdy fortifications, sending shockwaves through the Ayyubid princes of Syria. It's quite possible that this close cooperation with the Crusader kingdoms brought the next evolution to Mongol siege technology in the form of the counterweight trebuchet. Able to launch projectiles further and harder than a traction catapult, the trebuchet used weight and gravity to replace teams of men pulling on ropes. Having spread across Europe and carried to the region by the Crusader kingdoms, the Mongols carried it even further. For the siege of Shenyang, Kublai Khan requested Hulagu's son and successor, Abaka, to provide him with Arab engineers capable of building these fearsome weapons. Thus did engineers make the long trek across Mongol-dominated Eurasia to bring the trebuchet to the Great Khan in China. Shenyang and its sister city of Fancheng were defended by huge walls and moats so wide the traction catapults were powerless against them. Possibly, as identified by Stephen Hoare, the defending Song dynasty forces used some sort of cannon mounted on small boats to break the Mongol blockade and allow the cities to be continually resupplied by river. The siege dragged on for 5 years until the arrival of these trebuchets. Greatly outranging the defensive weapons within the cities, they broke both the walls and the spirit of the defenders. Having once picked up their first siege weapons in China, the Mongols returned with the most advanced weapons of the age. Yet the fall of Shenyang and the Song dynasty by the end of the decade also became the high-water mark of successful Mongol conquests. Successful sieges in their ensuing campaigns did not translate into strategic success, and in wars against the Mamluks and Delhi Sultanate, hot weather, strong fortresses, and able defense stood defiant against Mongol efforts. As catapults and other complicated siege machines became a smaller part of the armies after the end of the unified Mongol Empire, and they had less access to the vast reserves of manpower to send as fodder and to man large numbers of catapults, the successor Khanates could not repeat the many victories in siege warfare their grandfathers had enjoyed. Lacking in both political will and unity, they could not develop means to overcome their gradual deficiencies in siege warfare, though the heirs of Chinggis Khan remained yet deadly in open battle. The strength of the Mongol army rested on the same skill sets of all steppe nomads: mobility and deadly long-range firepower. Doctrine for all horse archers was simple: to maximize damage to the enemy from as far away as possible for as long as possible, only closing once they had been sufficiently demoralized, their formations broken by an unceasing rain of arrows, or tricked into leaving their lines in an effort to pursue the horsemen. The Mongols did not invent these techniques, but they did apply them at a scale beyond the mightiest of previous steppe empires, adapting them as necessary for a variety of situations. Mongolian and steppe nomadic army tactics evolved out of the routines of daily life. Each warrior on horseback had several remounts, armed with 2 or more bows and several quivers of arrows. This was the bare minimum to be a combatant, and effective enough for most situations. Riding a horse from their earliest years, and learning to draw and hunt with a bow from almost as early, by adulthood, every Mongol had a lifetime of experience shooting from horseback. Nearly every medieval writer comments on the Mongols' ensuing hardiness and stamina. The Mongols were able to endure hardship that made the armies of the sedentary world buckle. Peerless archers and expert riders, any commander would be a fool to not take advantage of such an army. The Mongol army was not trained as much as it was grown. The basic tactics evolved out of two tools: excellent bows and a massive supply of horses. Every Mongol was armed with a composite recurve bow, which they made themselves. Incredibly powerful, these bows could send arrows immense distances. One stone inscription from early 13th century Mongolia records that Chinggis Khan's nephew, Yasunge, sent an arrow almost 530 meters. This was likely a specially made light arrow designed for distance, and lacked any meaningful penetrative power at that range. Actual effective combat range is debated. Historian Timothy May suggests it was anything under 170 meters, while John Masson Smith Jr. puts 30 meters as the optimum distance to maximize accuracy and penetration. Regardless of the range, medieval authors consistently describe the Mongols as frighteningly accurate with their bows. In the Caucasus, where contact was easily made with several Turkic peoples proficient in horse archery, one Armenian chronicler specifically designated the Mongols as the nation of archers. Alongside the power of their bows, the horse was the other vital component of Mongolian tactics. Every nomad of the Great Eurasian steppe rode a horse, where vast grasslands provided the ideal environment for rearing them. The Mongol horse is smaller than those of sedentary regions, weighing under 300 kilograms and rarely more than 14 hands or 142 centimeters high at the withers, the shoulders. Unlike the grain and fodder-fed horses of China, Europe, or the Islamic world, the Mongolian horses lived almost exclusively off the abundant grasses of the steppe. So prime is this grassland that even today, Mongolia's horses outnumber the country's humans and account for over 6% of the world's horse population. When on campaign, each rider brought 5 or more horses with him, riding one a day and letting it rest for the following days while he rode the others. Like their riders, the Mongolian horses were hardy, surviving in conditions deadly for larger breeds. Sure-footed, well-trained and obedient, though not the fastest, the Mongolian horse was a reliable platform for battle. Campaigning and entering battle with strings of remounts provided the Mongols strategic opportunities unavailable to their enemies. This proficiency with a bow and easy access to great quantities of horses were the building blocks of the Mongols' deadliness in battle. Usually facing off against armies that could not amass any comparative number of horses or skilled bowmen, the Mongols enjoyed far greater striking power and mobility, their tactics maximizing this advantage and minimizing the need for prolonged close-quarter contact with the enemy. Perhaps the most recognizable manifestation of this was the caracole, what historian Timothy May believes is meant by the Shi-Uchi chisel attack mentioned in the Secret History of the Mongols. Waves of Mongols, organized in their decimal units, Arban, Jagan, or even Mingan, would ride towards the enemy, shooting arrows as they approached. At a set distance, perhaps the 30 meters or less suggested by John Masson Smith, the wave would pull away. As this wave fell back, the riders would turn in the saddle and fire backwards, the famous Parthian shot. With one wave falling back out of range and to safety to rest men and grab remounts, another wave advanced and carried out the same process, resulting in a continuous barrage of arrows. To do this successfully is tremendously difficult. It requires extensive training to not result in hundreds of men and horses crashing into each other or sending arrows into each other's backs. In order to function smoothly, each wave needs to know when the other wave is advancing or falling back and move accordingly, so as not to obstruct the forthcoming waves. When operating effectively, it was extraordinarily effective. For those subject to the Mongol caracole, it was an immense psychological attack alongside the storm of arrows. By nature, humans do not generally enjoy having large groups of horses run towards them. Having it occur repeatedly brings on the additional anxiety of not knowing which wave might not turn away but ride directly into their lines. All the while, arrows with shocking accuracy and power pick away at the other men in the line, whittling down both numbers and resolve. To someone on foot, the successive waves of horsemen would be impossible to count, appearing endless. Even well-trained men would struggle to fight their instincts to flee or charge out at the enemy in anger, both options aligning exactly with Mongol desires. If the enemy began to rout under the arrow fire, then instead of pulling back, one wave would instead charge into the enemy, falling upon fleeing men and taking advantage of the opening in the line. An enemy army in the midst of flight would be unable to resist, allowing the Mongols to ride them down much easier. If instead the enemy, especially proud cavalrymen, attempted to charge the Mongol caracol, then this allowed the Mongols to employ the favourite ploy of all steppe warriors, the feigned retreat. A feigned retreat is easy enough on paper, but difficult to execute in practice. When an enemy ran after the Mongols would appear to flee, panicked by the charge of the very brave and well-armoured enemy horsemen. There was a real danger of the feigned rout turning into a real one if the enemy horsemen reached the Mongols. Their often superior armour and training would allow them to wreak havoc on more lightly armoured Mongols. If orchestrated properly, however, the fleeing Mongols took their pursuers to ground of their choosing, where other Mongol units waited in preparation. Archers picked off the isolated enemy, and heavy cavalry delivered the final blow to the stragglers. If this had been all the enemy cavalry, the Mongols could then easily surround the surviving infantry and pick them off at their leisure. The feigned retreat was employed again and again across Eurasia. Against fortresses, where garrisons were tricked into coming out from their walls to chase fleeing nomads, to epic 9-day pursuits. The most famous was that which Subutai employed against the Rus and Kipchak at the Kalka River. Perhaps not quite the master plan it is often presented as, Subutai may have been genuinely fleeing before the Rus and Kipchak following the death of his friend and mentor Jebe while scouting the enemy army, as suggested in a recent article by historian Stefan Pau. Pursued across the steppe, Subutai saw the enemy formation lose structure, the faster Kuman Kipchaks gaining ahead of their Rus allies. Turning back to face them, on the Kalka River, Subutai brought the full might of his army against only a portion of the enemy. First, the Kipchak, who broke and ran into the oncoming Rus. With their advance halted, Mongol arrows now fell upon them. Order was lost, the Rus began to flee, and Subutai carried the day, annihilating the enemy army. In the event that the enemy did not pursue or rout, but instead held their position in orderly formation, the Mongols had another option, simply moving on. More mobile than their enemies, and always fighting in enemy territory, the Mongols could pull away and ravage the surrounding countryside, disheartening the enemy army by slaughtering the local population, filling the sky with the smoke of burning homes, or cutting off enemy access to water or resources. Defections and panic set in as refugees fled to the army with stories of Mongol brutality. A stationary foe, or one holding up in a wagon fort as the Hungarians did at Mohi in 1242, was soon trapped in a nege, a Mongolian hunting circle. Cordoning off the area, the Mongols would surround and gradually close in on the foe, cutting off avenues of escape and driving panicked villagers towards the target. At the strategic level, or while hunting, strict orders allowed nothing to leave the circle alive. But on the tactical level, the nege had a devious trick. A gap would be left in the steadily closing circle, apparently overlooked by the overeager Mongols. To those on foot, it seemed a silver lining. The Mongols understood the psychology of men and animals. When cornered with nowhere to run, they fight to the death. Provided a means to see another day, either tiger or man will seize the chance to live. And by doing so, they did exactly what the Mongols wanted. At Mohi, when the Hungarians fled through the gap in the line, the Mongols formed up beside the fleeing enemy, whose formation and sense to resist was long since abandoned. Once the foe was suitably bedraggled and exhausted, only then did the Mongols fall upon them, minimizing harm to themselves, but ensuring few if any escaped their clutches. Contrary to some depictions, heavy cavalry was used by the Mongols, though Asian cavalry differed from the heavy shock lancers imagined in Europe when the term is mentioned. For the Mongols, their own heavy armored cavalry was a minority, more usually utilizing subject peoples in this role. For the majority of Asian heavy cavalry, from China, Iran and the Turkic and Mongolian tribes of Central Asia, the primary weapon of heavy cavalry was still the bow, even when both horse and rider were fully armored. In the steppe, heavy armor was harder to procure with limited access to smiths and raw materials. The more common armor varieties reflected this, created from materials the Mongols had ready access to, felt and leather. Perhaps the most well-known was the Hatanga Del, a sort of thick, gambeson-like coat of thickly layered felt. Increasingly over the 13th century, the Hatanga was secured with metal plates within it for a brigandine. For man and horse protection, lamina was favoured, long layered bands of leather laced together. The most expensive was lamella, consisting of individual metal plates sewn together in rows. Flexible, the armour was designed to fold over the legs while on horseback, though the arms and hands were left exposed to not encumber usage of the bow. The Mongols considered lamella better protection against arrows than mail, as well as easier for nomads to both produce and maintain. Mongolian heavy cavalry was intended to be a decisive finishing blow against enemies weakened by arrow fire or drawn into feigned retreats, rather than engage in any sort of prolonged melee. With their smaller horses, the Mongols had to be careful to not overexert the animals, especially when fully armoured, and heavy cavalry charges were likely limited affairs in the early days of the conquests. As more subject peoples were added to the Mongol army, their own heavy cavalry would take on these vulnerable close-quarter roles, leaving the valuable Mongolian and Turkic horse archers safe to pick off the enemy from a distance. While fighting in China, Khitan, Jurchen and Tangut heavy cavalry were regularly employed by the Mongols, while in the Ilkhanate, Armenian and Georgian heavy cavalry were at the forefront of the Mongol wars in the region, particularly against the Mamluks. For extraordinary situations, the Mongols applied unorthodox tactics. At Mohi in 1241, the initial effort to storm the bridge was accompanied by Subutai attempting to build a bridge further downriver in an effort to flank the Hungarian army. When the Hungarians successfully resisted an attempt to force the bridge, the Mongols pulled back and early the following morning brought up catapults and shelled the guards left on the Hungarian side of the bridge. This was quickly followed up by a cavalry charge. The bridge over the Sayo River was taken and the Hungarian camp encircled. While fighting off a Burmese invasion into Mongol-controlled Yunnan in 1277, the sight and scent of the Burmese elephants frightened the Mongol horses. The Mongol commander quickly ordered his men to the tree line to tie them to the tree trunks. Dismounted, the Mongols advanced on foot and sent volleys of arrows into the elephants. Under the incessant barrage, the elephants panicked, crashing through the Burmese lines before leaving the battlefield. While part of the Mongol force continued providing covering fire, detachments filed back to the trees to remount their horses, continuing in this order until they were all on horseback. Where the Mongols' tactical ability failed them was in environments too unsuited to cavalry maneuvers. The humid jungles of Southeastern Asia, perhaps the greatest example of this. The conquest of the Song dynasty was only completed with the massive conscription of Chinese soldiers and creation of a fleet to challenge the Song on the vital rivers of South China. In Syria, historians like John Masson Smith have argued the region lacked the pasture capacity to provide for the vast horse herds the Mongols liked to bring with them, forcing them to advance with smaller forces the Mamluks could overcome. In straight tactical engagements, the Mongols performed their poorest against those who fought in similar fashion to themselves. Chinggis Khan's only defeats were against other tribes of the Mongolian steppe, and it seemed he considered the nomadic Turks of the western steppe, the Kuman Kipchaks, to be the single greatest foe against Mongol expansion. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and the Sultanate of Delhi both employed Turkic horse archers, often Kuman Kipchaks bought as slaves, to great effect against the Mongols. Essentially, these were armies which could recognize feigned retreats and nomadic ploys, and force the Mongols into engagements which minimized their superiority in horse numbers. An army is only as effective as its ability to feed and supply its own men, and the armies of the Mongol Empire were no exception. As with so much of the Mongol military, popular depictions of the logistical capabilities of the 13th century Mongol army are a mix of hyperbole and exaggerated claims of Mongol feats. Quite rightly, most discussions of the Mongols' logistical ability have focused on their lives as nomads and how they utilized their animal herds, sheep, goats, oxen, camels and horses. As pastoral nomads, their very lives provided them excellent experience in the skills of strategic logistics. Every seasonal movement had to be well planned and organized for timing of the weather and pasture availability. Pasture had to be carefully managed to avoid overgrazing, the animals kept in the right proportions for water usage and avoiding its contamination. Pastures for winter grazing needed to be secured and avoided. Lacking sufficient alternative fodder, the animals needed to be able to provide for themselves by eating through the snow, the sheep, goats and oxen following behind the horses as they instinctively dug through the snow with nose and hoof. In turn, each animal provided milk, meat, felt, clothing and more, providing nomads much of their requirements to survive. Each nomad had to learn how many animals were necessary to survive off of, and had a lifetime of experience moving vast herds of livestock from horseback over great distances. Any Mongol who survived to adulthood knew how to withstand harsh environments, live off little, make use of every part of the animal, and take advantage of local resources, all valuable skills for an army on the march. As stated, the Mongols did not provide fodder for their herds, subsisting them almost entirely off of grasses. In the Great Eurasian Steppes, this provided any nomadic people an immense advantage, not requiring the difficult and lengthy procurement of grain supplies for troops and horses. Larger horse breeds of sedentary societies, for example, cannot maintain body weight and strength enough to campaign from only grass alone and require regular feeding of hay or preferably grain. For the smaller horses of the Eurasian steppe, grass provided their necessary nutritional intake. With no shortage of grass in the steppe, it was also much easier to field immense herds of horses, far more than any sedentary rival power could compare to. A single Mongol warrior could go on campaign with 5 or more remounts, rotating between the horses so as not to overexert a single animal. While the vast herds of their animals were a key aspect of everyday life in Mongolia, the 5 snouts were rarely all brought on campaign. Sheep and goats simply cannot travel as quickly or as long as horses. 5 kilometers per day, or 3 miles, is a reliable speed with these animals. Depending on the campaign, and as conditions allowed, we sometimes see instead a central, slower moving army, which may have sheep, goats, supply and tool carts pulled by oxen, and some families, a base camp called an ordu, generally commanded by the Khan's or a general's wife in his absence. The warriors would ride separately in flying columns well ahead of the ordu. Traveling with only their horses, these columns could strike with greater speed before returning to this slower main body to resupply on those things which they could not have carried with them. This would mean stocking up on staples of the Mongol diet to carry back with them for the next stretch of the horse-only part of the attack. A group of 10 men, an arban, would stock up on strips of dried meat, borts, or dried milk curds called arul, or cheeses called izgi. The arbans returning out to campaign carried this among themselves and their spare horses, which themselves were a source of nutrition for the Mongols. Mares were preferred, as both their milk and blood could be drunk, providing nutritional value when other alternatives were scarce. If the horse died on the march, then it would be cut up on the spot for its meat to be reused. Even the bones would be used for a broth called shulen, thickened with millet and whatever pieces of meat and vegetables could be collected. These meals were augmented by hunting when they could, be it big game, enemy livestock or marmot, a useful practice to keep their archery skills sharp as well. Little was wasted, and numerous primary sources remark, often with disgust, at the willingness of the Mongols to eat anything. But the Mongols knew quite well that picky eaters did not last long in the cold winter. Yet even in the steppe, the supplying of so many animals was not without issue, especially at the end of winter or in drier years. When campaigning against their enemies, this became an even greater struggle, for there were simply not the same expanses of grassland to rely upon the further they rode from the steppes. In order to overcome this, the Mongols relied on an exceptionally predatory foraging strategy. Mongol armies travelled in divisions and smaller units, spreading themselves out across the countryside, feeding their horses on both the smaller areas of grassland and local grain stores, while the riders would feed themselves on the peasants' harvests. This would also play into their strategy of harassing and driving the peasants from farms and rural villages towards major urban centres, spreading fear and straining the enemy's resources. It also had an advantage of making it difficult to react to Mongol armies. For the defenders, reports would come in of Mongols everywhere, coming and going in each direction. The chaos of the panic-stricken flights of the peasants would have certainly brought with them exaggerated stories of the scale of the enemy forces, sowing always further confusion. This takes us to one of the most popular myths of the Mongols, that they were a shockingly fast force, a lightning bolt from the steppes. This is a result partly of the intentional confusion caused by the Mongols. When they were striking cities hundreds of kilometers apart, it would seem they were crossing great distances at lightning speeds. But calculations by John Mason Smith Jr., noting, when available, the rough length of time and distance travelled by the Mongol armies, found there could be great variation in the speed at which they travelled. The greatest speed recorded was the Great Invasion of Western Eurasia under Batu and Subutai in the 1230s. Their journey from Karakoram to the Volga River, nearly 5,000 kilometers over an estimated 6 months, made an average daily speed of around 27 kilometers per day. This part of the journey, with little campaigning and nothing but grassland before them, was made with the greatest haste. In Smith's calculations, the average kilometers per day for other campaigns with available data was around 22 to 24 kilometers per day. Smith suggests that the speed made by Batu and Subutai was the maximum top speed for an army based on steppe horses in ideal conditions. Time in the day needed to be given for the horses to graze and sleep, and as it takes longer for horses to meet their daily feed requirements via grazing rather than grain, this puts a cap on the top speed of these armies. And yet such ideal conditions would not be met elsewhere. Smith is also able to make calculations for much of Hulagu's route during his march in the 1250s. At the fastest part of his journey from Karakoram to Almalik, Hulagu covered approximately 2,697 kilometers in some 6 months, some 15 kilometers per day. Across Transoxiana and Iran, Hulagu rarely made such speeds again, usually between 6 and 9 kilometers per day depending, and often halting for months at a time. For Hulagu, the campaign was much more methodical than the immense tidal waves they are often depicted as. The sources describe Hulagu marching in the mornings, then allowing the horses to graze over the afternoon and sleep through the night, while his own men rested and drank. It's important to note that for armies like Hulagu's, often estimated around some 70 to 150,000 men, only a part of the force was actually Mongolian. Aside from fellow nomadic peoples like the steppe Turkic tribes who would handle the journey similarly, semi-nomadic Khitans and Jurchen accompanied them, as did Tanguts, northern Chinese, especially as engineers, and other subject people along the route through Transoxiana and Iran. Such huge and varied armies could not live off Mongol mares' milk and blood. Instead, such campaigns took advantage of the ever-developing administration of the Mongol Empire. By the time of Hulagu's expedition, Great Khan Mongke ordered vast depots of supplies to be made for his brother's army along the route, immense hills of skins of flour and wine produced from across Western Asia. All pastures that Hulagu's armies may need were to be cleared and let fallow for their horses. Roads were cleared, bridges built and mended, or ferries prepared to aid in their passage, both for the men and the many carts travelling with them, carrying supplies, weapons, and tools to construct siege machines. As Hulagu marched across Asia, he met with Mongol-appointed governors and vassals, who had to arrange more supplies for the army. Marches had to be carefully timed, aiming to avoid the harshest summer weathers and take advantage of pasture availability. While it is popular to think of the Mongols living and fighting purely from their horses, by the time of their great campaigns, they needed supplies as much as everyone else. These marches were generally made without the families of the warriors. Even for Hulagu himself, most of his wives were only able to arrive in the Ilkhanate by the end of the 1260s. Only then did they learn of Hulagu's death in 1265. If even for a royal prince it was hard to bring his wives with him, then a great many Mongolian families were permanently separated by the campaigns. For Tama garrisons stationed on the frontiers of the empire, such a consequence was outright stated. Travelling without their original families in the regions where these Tama forces were based, such as parts of modern Afghanistan and Azerbaijan, these men took local wives and mixed with local cultures. The family separation policy of the Khans accounts in part for the rapid absorption of the Mongols into the Turkic and Farsi peoples in the west of the empire. Much of the aforementioned comments are also reflected in the arming of the Mongol soldiers. For their base equipment, each Mongol was expected to produce and maintain his own weapons, building his own bows and arrows, his own saddle and the like. At the start of the conquests, blacksmithing in Mongolia was difficult but not impossible. Access to raw materials was a great hurdle and often relied on trading with the Chinese dynasties to their south. For these reasons, specialized equipment such as swords and full sets of metal armors would have been uncommon and restricted to those with the wealth and means to afford them. If the average Mongol trooper had a metal weapon, it was likely cheaper yet effective, such as maces and spears, or if metal armor, perhaps nothing more than a helmet. As the empire expanded, so too did their access to more varied weapons and armors. A great many Mongols simply must have repurposed looted equipment. After a battle, Chinggis Khan's orders were to collect and redistribute the weapons and armor of the defeated enemy forces, though doubtless the Mongol elite and bodyguards were given priority in this. From both conquest and tribute, as well as the forced migrations of artisans and craftsmen, the Mongols gained reliable access to great numbers of blacksmiths and the raw materials necessary for their crafts. On the eve of the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the rising members of Chinggis Khan's entourage and a great minister of the Mongol Empire, Chinkai, founded Chinkai Belesagun, meaning Chinkai's city, in western Mongolia. Made of mainly captured and relocated Chinese craftsmen, Chinkai turned this into one of several manufacturing centers in Mongolia. Both a farming settlement and weapons production facility, it supplied Chinggis's host as they moved west for the invasion of Khwarezm. Even the imperial capital, Karakorum, had smithies and arms producers. It is unclear to what extent these finished products actually made their way to the regular soldiers outside of arrow production. By providing their warriors millions of iron-tipped arrows, the Khans would have been giving them the most effective and deadliest assistance they could. No evidence seems to indicate that there was ever a concerted effort to armor the vast majority of Mongol troops or provide them a regular kit, though the soldiers were expected to have some base equipment, such as knives, bows, ropes, sewing kits, and other basic tools. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, during his return journey to Europe from the court of the Grand Khan in the early 1250s, had only 2 of the 20 Mongols assigned to protect him armoured. Both were in hauberks of mail from the Alans of the northern Caucasus, according to Rubruck. Other travellers, such as John de Plano Carpini and Marco Polo, also indicate that outside of the Khan's Keshig, little effort was made to furnish the regular army with equipment. Communication between their forces was an important tool of the Khans. In this, they developed one of history's most famous postal systems, the Yam. Situated on average roughly 30 kilometers apart, the Yam stations, also known as Ortu, were locally supplied relay stations, which snaked across the whole of the Mongol Empire. The communities the Ortu were situated in provided foodstuffs and animals. Messengers bearing either written or verbal communication would ride furiously to each station. There they would be resupplied, fed, jump onto fresh horses, and be on their way to bear messages to and fro. Each user was provided a passport called Garega in Mongolian or Paisa in Chinese. The highest level of the Garega, the Golden Tiger Head, bore the name of Chinggis Khan and stated, "By the name of Chinggis Khan, endowed by the eternal blue heaven, this man is empowered to act with the same freedom as I myself should exercise had I come in person." Below it would list what supplies this level of passport provided the bearer. The Yam system may have been brought to Chinggis Khan's attention by defectors from the Jin Empire, be they Chinese, Jurchen or Khitan, or they may have organically emerged out of necessity of retaining some semblance of authority over the ever-growing empire. No matter the origin, Chinggis Khan had recognized the utility of such a system by the 1210s. The Yam was expanded over the course of the 13th century, particularly under Ogadai and Moncur, but it was continually disrupted, and it was a source of frustration for the locals, who had to both supply the Yam and the greedy officials and merchants taking advantage of their generosity. In much of the empire, its presence was marginal even at the height of the authority of the great Khans, yet it provided means to connect far-flung sections of the empire and retain contact between the various long-ranging armies carrying out the Khan's will. Via the Yam, orders could be relayed across the empire to organize timetables, such as the new censuses carried out on the orders of Moncur, and then the demands for troops and supplies to be mobilized. Because of this, Hulagu was able to meet up with more contingents and successfully stocked food depots without needless delays. By the time he reached the Hashashin fortress of Maymundis, so successfully had the Yam stations been able to line up the campaign, that forces sent from the Jochid Ulus were able to cross the Caucasus and unite with Hulagu in northern Iran for the fall of these fortresses. Both armies had marched on opposite sides of the Caspian Sea. While films and video games like Ghost of Tsushima often show the Mongol conquests undertaken by forces entirely consisting of the Mongols, this is a gross simplification. The majority of the army serving the Great Khans was multi-ethnic and not made up only of nomads. Even during his war for the unification of Mongolia, the warlord Temujin was relying on troops of different backgrounds. While all were nomads practicing the same horseback archery, not all were speakers of Mongolian languages. Many were Turkic peoples, some of whom were even Eastern Christians, popularly called Nestorians. For horsemen of the steppe, these sorts of ethnic distinctions were fluid. Tribal names generally served to mark lineages, both real and imagined, and political loyalties which could shift as necessary. So once these Turkic groups submitted to Temujin, and especially once he took the title of Chinggis Khan, these tribes would signify their loyalty by deeming themselves Mongols as well, usually involving the adoption of Mongolian hairstyles and clothing. For any nomadic steppe confederation, This is not a unique process. From the Huns to the Gokturks, such an approach can be seen again and again. Following the declaration of the empire in 1206, Chinggis Khan rapidly began to expand the Mongol Ulus, incorporating neighboring peoples into his army, many of whom were speakers of Turkic languages, who were nomadic, semi-nomadic, and even agriculturalists. The forest peoples around Lake Baikal, the Kyrgyz of the Yenisei River Valley, the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, the Karluks of Al-Malik, and the Ongut in what is now Inner Mongolia. Some, like the Uyghurs, had a great role in the emerging administrative system. It was from the Uyghurs that Chinggis Khan adopted a script for the Mongolian language, still in use today in Inner Mongolia. While Chinggis was incorporating these peoples into his army, it was fundamentally not changing the army itself, for it was their cavalrymen he incorporated. For his early campaigns in the steppe, infantry was too great a liability. However, once Chinggis Khan began to take his war to the more powerful sedentary kingdoms in what is now China, he required a shift in his operational thinking. Fighting against the Tangut kingdom, his horsemen had little offensive capability against city walls. Dominating in a field battle, they lacked the knowledge to besiege cities effectively. For this, he would need to incorporate sedentary peoples into his forces. While Chinggis Khan won his first significant field battles against the Jurchen Jin dynasty through the might of his horsemen and their arrows, he understood that to make any lasting gains, he would need to utilize the very inhabitants of the Jin Empire against their Jurchen masters. Within the Jin dynasty were three primary groups: the Jurchen, a Tungusic people hailing from Manchuria and ancestors of the Manchu, who made up the ruling elite of the dynasty; the Khitans, a people related to the Mongols who a century prior had ruled North China and Mongolia during the Liao dynasty until being conquered by the Jurchen; and the Northern Chinese, who made up the vast majority of the population. Even before the invasion began, the Khitans, who made up much of the Jin dynasty's military, were defecting to Chinggis Khan, providing intelligence and horsemen. Having been treated as second class since the Jurchen conquest and denied advancement in the military, there was long simmering antagonism between the Khitan leaders and the Jin. The Jin rulers, fearful of a Khitan revolt in the face of the Mongol attacks in 1211, had sent Jurchen colonists among them in an attempt to subdue them. The effort backfired monstrously, creating the revolt they so feared and resulting in a restored Liao dynasty, which immediately submitted to Chinggis Khan and provided more Khitan forces to aid in his conquest. Not only were they men and horses for the Great Khan, but they also took the same resources away from the Jin Emperor and stretched their forces even thinner. While they were undoubtedly important for the fighting in China, we know Khitan horsemen would accompany the Mongols in the west. In late 1218 or early 1219, when Jochi and Subutai were returning through Kazakhstan from hunting down Merkit refugees near the Caspian Sea, they were attacked by the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II. In the fighting, Jochi was injured and nearly overtaken by Khwarezmian troops until he was rescued by a timely charge of a Khitan prince in his keshik. Perhaps the most significant addition to the Mongol war effort in China was the mass incorporation of northern Chinese into the Khan's army. It was the adoption of Chinese military and siege engineers which allowed the Mongols to learn the ways of siege warfare and have the manpower to experiment with it. The Mongol leadership always wanted to avoid expending the valuable lives of their nomadic horse archers. Each one was a lifetime's investment and hugely effective in the open field. To use them to push siege equipment was simply to waste them. The Mongols recognized this early on, and it was for these tasks they employed their ever-growing new Chinese army. From pushing siege equipment to filling in moats, to manning catapults and scaling ladders, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Chinese were brought into the Mongol army within years of the start of the conquest. Many were undoubtedly forced, driven before the Mongols as a veritable human wave to absorb the arrows of the defenders. But it cannot be dismissed that many willingly joined the Mongols, particularly once it seemed the Jin dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, the right to rule in China, when they abandoned their capital of Zhengdu in 1215. By the time Chinggis Khan took his forces west in 1219 against the Khwarezmian Empire, there were far more Chinese fighting on behalf of the Mongols in China than there were Mongols fighting in China. While some of these Chinese forces were under the command of Mongol, Turkic, Khitan or Uyghur officers, many were led by Chinese warlords and militia leaders who sided with the Khans, like Shi Tianzi or Cheng Zhou. These were men who not only willingly served the Khan of Khans, but did so with extraordinary loyalty. Shi Tianzi and his family would remain prominent military leaders under the Mongols until the reign of Kublai Khan, and Cheng Zhou was the most trusted lieutenant of the brilliant Mongol commander Mukhali. With Chinggis Khan absent fighting the Khwarezmian Empire, Mukhali was left as a viceroy to keep the Jin dynasty occupied until the Khan should return. From 1217 until his death in 1223, Mukhali led a stunning, highly mobile campaign throughout the reduced Jin Empire. City after city was taken and retaken, while Mukhali drove his armies to within striking distance of the new Jin capital at Kaifeng. While Mukhali's main force was Turkic and Mongolian horsemen, augmented by Tangut cavalry, in other provinces in China, Mukhali left command to officers like Cheng Zhou, who fiercely fought against the Jin to expand the Mongol Empire. Neither the Jurchens nor the Mongols were Chinese, yet in much of the increasingly ruined Jin Empire, the fighting was being undertaken almost exclusively between the Chinese subjects of both states. In the area around the Shandong Peninsula, this became particularly confusing. Here, an uprising against Jin rule broke out, known as the Redcoats. Here, loosely aligned warlords, some independent, some aligned with the Mongols, some aligned with the Song dynasty, and all hating the Jin, fought themselves, the Mongols, the Song, and the Jin. Some, like Li Chuan, joined the Mongols and on their behalf fought the Jin and the Song for decades, earning high status and rewards from the Mongol government. Li Chuan's son, Li Tan, lasted as a prominent regional warlord until he revolted against Kublai Khan in 1262, likely on account of Song bribes and their empty promises. Only in reaction to this did the Mongols crack down on the power of Chinese warlords in their service. Despite the restriction of their independence, the Chinese in Mongol service only increased in importance as their war advanced into the more humid, less horse-friendly climate of southern China. Against the Song dynasty, a vast army and riverine navy of Chinese was assembled, serving alongside a corps of Mongol horsemen and often under the command of Mongols and Central Asian Persians and Turks. By the end of the war against the Song dynasty, during the pursuit of the fleeing boy emperors to the island of Yaishan, the combined Mongol-Chinese army was under the supreme command of a northern Chinese, Zhang Hongfan, assisted by a Uyghur, Arik Kaya, and a Central Asian Muslim, Omar. The Mongol conquest of China could not have been completed without the manpower of the Chinese or their military skill for taking cities. The Mongols made heavy use of Chinese manpower. Cities in Mongolia like Karakoram and Chinkai-Belesegan were built using laborers from China. Chinkai-Belesegan served as an industrial and farming hub, manned by Chinese, to help supply Mongol armies as they passed through Western Mongolia on campaign. When planning the Great Western Invasion in the 1230s, the Mongols considered sending west a vast army of Chinese infantry with them. This was dismissed early on in the proceedings, deeming them unsuitable to such a journey. However, Chinese siege engineers were brought with the Mongol armies on Chinggis Khan's invasion of Khwarezm, almost certainly with Batu and Subutais' 1230s western campaign, and with Hulagu in the 1250s, thousands of them and their families, to assist him in taking the remaining fortresses of the Islamic world. But the Chinese were not the only ones brought into use in the Mongol armies in the west. As the Mongols advanced across the western steppe, many of the local Turkic tribes were absorbed into their forces. During Jebe Noyan's swift conquest of the Karakitai, the local garrisons largely submitted to their new Mongol masters without issue, but there's not substantial evidence to suggest they accompanied Chinggis Khan against Khwarezm. In the Khwarezmian Empire, much of the military was Turkic Kipchak tribes, a great number of whom freely abandoned their posts to join the Mongols upon invitation and fight against their former employers. We have already noted Chinggis Khan's mass employment of forced levies, driving the local population before his armies much as he had done in China. With his forces now experienced in siege warfare from the fighting in China, there was less of a need for defections, as long as the Mongols could use the locals in the most vulnerable positions. After Chinggis's bloody campaign ended, however, the Mongols were more amenable to utilizing the locals militarily, generally for garrisoning cities. Regional commanders appointed by the Mongols would not have had access to substantial numbers of nomadic troops. Therefore, when rebellions did rise up after the conquest, the initial responding force would not be Mongols from the steppe, but locally raised militia. The western invasion of Batu and Subutai provides a few notable mentions of foreign troops in Mongol employ. The heavy usage of catapults against the Rus cities suggests the presence of Chinese siege engineers. We have Tanguts taking part in the siege of the Alan capital of Magus, alongside many Alans newly conscripted to the Mongol army. When a Mongol raiding party was captured in Austria, the Austrians were surprised to find an Englishman in their employ, a man who had apparently served as interpreter and envoy on behalf of the Mongols. Men were also taken in the opposite direction as well. Rus, Kipchak and Alan men were carried east to serve in the Mongol military, often filling the role of bodyguards. The general assumption seems to have been that transplacing these men like this ensured their loyalty. A young Kipchak warrior would be unlikely to learn Chinese well enough to start taking bribes or escape on his own, and therefore be forced to remain utterly loyal to the Khan. After the end of Mongol imperial unity, the reliance on non-Mongols became even greater. The Ilkhanate made heavy use of Georgians and Armenians from Cilicia and beyond, largely as heavy cavalry, who often took a primary role in their many battles against the Mamluk Sultanate. While some have suggested this was due to the superiority of the Caucasian heavy horse, it may just be again the Mongol inclination to place their foreign, expendable troops into the most vulnerable positions and thus save their own men. Kublai Khan's foreign ventures towards the end of his life demonstrate the reliance on non-Mongols for roles his horsemen could not fill, leaving many of the Mongols to guard major sites, particularly on his border with the Central Asian Khanates. Kublai's famous and often disastrous overseas attacks were usually made up of Chinese troops, augmented by the people inhabiting the part of his empire in the closest direction to that which he wanted to strike. For the invasion of Japan, Koreans built and manned much of the ships that made up the navy, especially in the first invasion, while northern Chinese, Jurchens and Khitans, as well as Mongols, made up the varied assaulting forces. For the invasions of Dai Viet, Champa and Pagan, Mongols fought alongside former Song troops, as well as men raised from Yunnan and the small kingdoms on the late Song dynasty's southwestern border. The navies supporting the Vietnamese invasions and attacks on Java were ships raised from southern China, manned by Chinese crews. For the attack on Java, the command was just as varied. The army was led by a former Song commander, Gao Xing, the navy commanded by a Uyghur, Yikmis, and the total force was under the overall command of a Mongol named Shi Bi. The Mongol army was never a homogeneous body. Aside from these most obvious mentions we have made, there were thousands upon thousands of men from across Eurasia who served the Mongols in less exciting roles. Local scouts to show them routes, smiths and artisans from Central Asia carried with the force to help produce and maintain weapons and supplies needed for the daily function of the army, physicians from China who must have set broken bones and mended wounds from Korea to Afghanistan. While the Mongols themselves provided the necessary edge in direct warfare, it was the vast support system and ability to draw on the knowledge and traditions of peoples across Eurasia which allowed the Mongols to expand beyond the Eurasian steppe. The rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century cannot be attributed to a single new military invention providing technological supremacy over their enemies. Still, the Mongols were adept in employing the tools of their foes. As historian Timothy May wrote, "The Mongols rarely met a weapon they did not like." But what was the role of the Mongols in the transmission of gunpowder and gunpowder weapons over the 13th and 14th centuries? For some historians, like J.J. Saunders or Kate Raphael, the idea of the Mongols as both users of gunpowder and transmitters of its knowledge to the West is a total negative or extremely unlikely. But the great British sinologist Joseph Needham demonstrated thoroughly that the Mongols used a variety of gunpowder weapons during their wars in China, while more recent historians, such as Iqtidar Alam Khan, Thomas T. Ulson, and Stephen G. Hoare, have argued that the Mongols carried a number of gunpowder weapons, such as bombs, fire lances, and rockets, west in their conquests over the rest of Eurasia. The first recipe for gunpowder appears during the Tang dynasty in the 8th century CE in a Taoist work urging alchemists not to mix saltpeter, potassium nitrate, sulfur, and carbon-rich materials like coal, and to especially not add arsenic to the mixture, as the result would light a flame. The Chinese quickly found the energy produced by these materials quite mesmerizing when used in fireworks display and in civil engineering projects and mining. Contrary to some popular sentiments that the Chinese only used it for peaceful purposes, it did not take long for it to be turned to warfare. By 1044, possibly in reaction to military defeats against the Tangut Xixia, the Song dynasty was presented a collection of 9 kinds of gunpowder weapons and 3 distinct gunpowder recipes in the Wujing Zongyao. This technology advanced under the Song dynasty, which faced a collection of ever more fearsome foes on its northern borders. These weapons took a number of forms: bombs thrown from catapults, huopao, enclosed in pottery or fragmenting metal shells; arrows, huojian, with incendiary packages strapped to them, launched from bows or massive mounted crossbows, developing into early rockets over the 12th century. Most infamous was the fire lance, huojiang, a bamboo or metal tube capable of shooting a jet of flame 3 meters in length, sometimes with shrapnel and toxic materials packed into the tube to form a terrifying, flame-spouting shotgun, some to explode and throw armor-piercing shrapnel, some to spread flame and destroy buildings, with others to have a choking, blinding gas dispersed by the explosion to envelop and confuse the enemy. The Song dynasty government was so terrified of their foes acquiring them that it prohibited the sale of any of the materials composing gunpowder to the Khitan Liao dynasty or Tangut Xixia in the 11th century. Both lacked access to natural reserves of saltpeter-producing lands. But with the Jurchen conquest of the Liao and northern Song in the early 12th century, the newly formed Jin dynasty seized not only stores of these weapons, but the knowledge and resources to produce their own. The first textual references to fire lances, rockets, and new kinds of bombs appear as Song forces desperately resisted Jin invasions. When Chinggis Khan invaded the Jin dynasty in 1211, whole companies of Chinese siege engineers entered into his service, bringing with them knowledge to construct Chinese siege engines. One such Chinese siege specialist, who willingly deserted, Guo Baoyu, accompanied Chinggis Khan west on his campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. According to his biography in the Yuan Shi, when the Mongols attempted to force a crossing of the Amu Darya, a number of Khwarezmian ships blocked their path. Guo Baoyu ordered a volley of huojian to be launched against the fleet. The ships were all set aflame, allowing the Mongols passage. While huojian originally and literally meant fire arrows, according to Joseph Needham, Ji Xingpan, and Thomas Alsen, over the 12th century, the term came to signify rockets, when powdered gunpowder mixtures with higher percentages of saltpeter, charcoal, and less sulfur made for effective rocket propellants. While Chinggis Khan certainly brought Chinese siege engineers westwards with him, gunpowder was not a key component of his tactics. Likely, Chinggis lacked the resources to manufacture gunpowder and gunpowder weapons, and if he was making use of them, it was in limited quantities and quickly depleted. After Chinggis Khan's death in 1227, his son and successor, Ogedai, completed the war with the Jin dynasty, in the process acquiring greater experience with gunpowder weapons, as well as the natural and manpower resources to produce them. In 1231, for instance, the Jin utilized a new development in bomb technology, the heaven-shaking thunder bomb Jian Tianlei, to sink Mongol ships in a naval engagement. These were bombs with high nitrate content encased in a cast iron shell. When set off, they created a monstrous noise like thunder, splintering the iron shell into a wave of armor and flesh-tearing shrapnel, an early fragmentation grenade. In 1232, the great Mongol general Sube'etei engaged the Jin capital of Kaifeng in a year-long siege in which both sides utilized gunpowder weapons. Sube'etei's catapults launched bombs into the city, while the Jin defenders annihilated mobile shelters pushed up to the walls by dropping thunder crash bombs on them via an iron chain. The defenders also employed a number of flying fire spears, Feihuojiang. Depending on the interpretation, these were fire lances packed with wads of shrapnel and arrows, which when fired acted like a flaming shotgun, while others, like Jixing Pan, suggest these were rockets. At one point in the siege, a Jin commander took 450 men armed with flying fire lances into the Mongol encampment, a surprise attack resulting in hundreds of Mongol troops killed or drowned when they tried to flee. It was remarked that the thunder crash bombs and flying fire lances were the only two weapons the Mongols feared. Yet these devices could not arrest the fate of the dynasty. The reliability of these weapons was questionable. Different proportions of the chemicals might result in a device going off early, too late, or not at all. The range of these weapons was short, and they were best utilized in defense, in situations where their effect on enemy morale could be maximized. These bombs were not yet the secret to destroying city walls, though they could damage wooden structures, towers, or gates along the battlements. Regardless, they were a frightful weapon when used properly. Thus it seems unusual that Sube'etei, the commander of the final campaigns against the Jin, who faced these gunpowder weapons, made little use of them in the Great Western Campaign begun a few years later. Though specialized Chinese artillery was employed against the Alans of the North Caucasus, Rus principalities and Hungarians, there is little direct indication of the use of gunpowder weaponry in the West. Many of the mostly wooden cities of the Rus principalities were burned, but the Rus sources generally offer no description of how this occurred. A possible indication is supplied by the Franciscan friar John de Plano Carpini, who travelled through the Rus principalities late in the 1240s, bearing messages from the Pope to the Great Khan. In his report, Carpini very accurately describes Mongol battle and siege tactics, with the intention that his observations would help prepare Christendom against further attacks. He wrote that the Mongols threw Greek fire onto cities, in addition to melted down fat from prisoners, a combination which was very difficult to extinguish. As the Mongols, as far as is known, did not use Greek fire, it seems that Carpini attempted to describe an incendiary of unusual properties using cultural terms he was familiar with. As Carpini's knowledge of siege tactics came from survivors in the Rus territories, it seems to imply that a special type of fire-causing weapon was used against the Rus, quite possibly the gunpowder weapons Sube'etei had brought from China. The famous smokescreen employed by Mongol forces at the Battle of Liegnitz in Poland in April 1241 may also have been a type of gunpowder weapon, as suggested by Stephen Hoare. Devices to deploy toxic smoke and smoke screens have been used in Chinese warfare since at least the 4th century CE, but during the Song dynasty, more effective versions were developed with gunpowder. In easily shatterable pottery containers, these weapons were packed with poisons, foul-smelling ingredients, shrapnel, arsenic and lime. Dispersed by the force of the explosion, these bombs unleashed a cloud or fog of painful gas which blinded, disoriented and confused enemy forces, very similar to the smoke weapon described at Liegnitz. Not understanding it was a gunpowder weapon, either a bomb via a small catapult or modified fire lance, the Poles focused on the most visible tool as the origin of the smoke, mistakenly identifying a Mongolian horsehair standard as the device. Lacking words for these new devices, which the Mongols were unwilling to let non-military individuals examine, it is hard to determine when a medieval author is using a familiar term such as Greek fire or naphtha to refer to a new technology which served a similar purpose. In some cases, it's even hard to tell if it's just a dramatic description. Such is the case of the Persian writer Giovanni's account of Hulagu's campaign in the 1250s, to which he was a direct eyewitness. Giovanni writes of how Hulagu was provided by his brother, the Grand Khan Mongke, 1,000 households of Chinese catapultmen, as well as naphtha throwers. At the siege of the Nizari assassin fortress of Meymandiz, Giovanni mentions a large crossbow-like weapon deployed by Hulagu's Chinese siege engineers, which he called an oxbow, a direct translation of the Chinese term for the weapon. Giovanni writes that it delivered meteoric shafts which burnt the enemy, in comparison to stones lobbed by the defenders, which did little but harm a single person. These oxbows in Chinese warfare, as described by the Wujingzong Yao, could have gunpowder packages attached to the bolts, and were used in the same manner as Giovanni describes. While some historians like Stephen Hoare see this as a clear usage of gunpowder, it must be remarked that Giovanni's tendency for over-flowery language makes it difficult to gauge how literal this passage must be taken, though he was an eyewitness to the siege. Generally, it seems that gunpowder was used little in the Mongols' western campaigns. Likely, difficulties in travelling with it prevented them from taking great quantities of it, and at the time of the conquests, there was not sufficient knowledge in the West that allowed them to procure more supplies. The matter was very different in the continuing Mongol wars in China, where under Kublai Khan, bombs were a main component of the wars against the Song dynasty, which also employed them. Thousands of bombs were made every month in the Song dynasty, though getting them to where they needed to be was another matter. One Song official in 1257, inspecting the border arsenals, lamented how poorly supplied these vulnerable sites were in these weapons, and how repeated requests to the central government were fruitless. The Song continued to throw whatever they could against the Mongols as they advanced deeper into southern China. But by then, the Mongols not only had ample supplies of these weapons for war in China, but manpower reserves, a powerful military structure, and a leadership hell-bent on overrunning the south, driven by the energetic Kublai, who believed in the eventuality of his conquest. Kublai's great general Bayan set up ranks upon ranks of Huo Pao during his drive to Hangzhou, lobbing stones to pound down the walls, gunpowder bombs to annihilate gates and towers, and terrify the defenders within. Against such an implacable foe, the last of Song resistance was ground to dust. It appears that an advance in gunpowder weapons was made sometime in the late 13th century. Near the ruins of Kublai's summer capital of Shangdu, the earliest confirmed cannon has been found, bearing a serial number and an inscription in the Fagspa script dating it to 1298, weighing 6 kilograms, 13 pounds 11 ounces, and just under 35 centimeters, approximately 14 inches, in length. It suggests a product of considerable experimentation and systemization. Much more primitive and rougher versions have been found that seem to date to the last years of the Tangut Shisha dynasty, crushed in 1227 by Chinggis Khan. It is probable that the evolution of fire lances from bamboo to metal tubes was a stepping stone to larger metal tubes capable of larger gunpowder charges and projectiles, brought on by the emergency of the Mongol invasions. Only in the last years of the 13th century did these models reach a level of standardization and sophistication to become true bombards, and more sophisticated models are known from over the 14th century. There are a few passages from the 13th and 14th century Chinese texts which may indicate the usage of these cannons, usually in naval engagements, where muzzle flashes seemed to be described when Mongol ships fire upon fleeing Jin ships, or with small vessels at the blockade of Shenyang bearing Huopao, but from ships too small for catapults. Much like the Western texts, the Chinese did not yet have a name for this new technology though. Calling them Huopao, the same name for the catapults which threw gunpowder bombs, it is impossible to know, unless a description is given, which texts refer to bombs and which to early cannons. From 1288, we have perhaps the earliest description of small handheld guns or cannons. In the war against his rebel cousin Nayan, Kublai Khan led his army against Nayan himself, but attacked from multiple fronts. One such operation was led by a Jurchen commander in Kublai's service, Li Ting. Using the word for fire catapult or cannon, Huopao, Li Ting and his small squad of Korean soldiers one night snuck into an encampment of Nayan's men in Manchuria and set off these weapons to great effect. From the context, it is clear that these weapons are too small and mobile to be catapults. In further support of this interpretation, it appears one of these actual weapons was found. Discovered in 1970 in Heilongjiang province, near where Li Tang's troops fought Nayan, a small bronze cannon or handgun has been discovered from an archaeological site supporting a late 13th century context. Weighing 3.5 kilograms, 34 centimeters in length, with a bore of 2.5 centimeters, these were small anti-personnel weapons. Not much use against walls, but devastating against men and horses. The Yuan dynasty continued to produce cannons over the 14th century. One well-known example from 1332 bears an inscription with its date and purpose of manufacture, intended to be used on board a ship for suppression of rebels. By the rise of Zhuyuanzhang and the Ming dynasty in the late 14th century, cannons and other firearms were standard features of Chinese armies. So did the Mongols spread gunpowder westwards. Recipes for gunpowder, and even the first gunpowder weapons, appear in Europe, the Islamic world and India late in the 13th century and early 14th centuries after the Mongol expansions. However, the diffusion is difficult to track due to the already mentioned ambiguities in terminology. It's likely that the Mongol armies did not travel with great quantities of powder and were reluctant to share its knowledge. It is notable though, that when perhaps the earliest recipe for gunpowder is recorded in Arabic in 1280 by Hassan al-Ramah, he records the ingredients as being Chinese in origin, with saltpeter for instance called Chinese snow, or rockets as Chinese arrows. A common word for gunpowder in Arabic and Persian meant drug, a literal translation of the Chinese huoyao, fire drug, which implies that knowledge was transmitted directly from Chinese engineers in Mongol service. By the start of the 14th century, fireworks appear as objects of regular entertainment in the Ilkhanate. Many diplomats, travelers, priests and merchants made the trek from Europe across the Mongol Empire and back, and many brought gifts from the Khans with them, or observed closely the Mongol army in an attempt to learn its secrets. The Franciscan friar, William of Rubruck, spent time with a European goldsmith in Mongol service, William Bukia, the man who made the famous Silver Tree of Karakoram. Bukia appears to have worked often in conjunction with Chinese artisans in his work for the Mongols. Though Rubruck does not describe gunpowder, he did meet, while back in Paris, the first European who did, Roger Bacon, who later describes with amazement his experience viewing Chinese firecrackers going off in Europe. Even if the Mongol army itself did not directly or intentionally transfer gunpowder, or use it in quantities to replace their own bows and arrows, they opened the pathways that allowed its knowledge to move across the Eurasian continent. Over the early decades of the 14th century, fearsome handguns and bombards became regular features of battlefields across the continent, the secret to gunpowder no longer restricted to Chinese dynasties. More videos on Mongol history are on the way. so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.